This doesn't make any sense. Players put the pieces on the game board? Who would put pieces? Oh my God, you scared me. What are you even doing in my house? Oh, I get it. I'm Jeff Marchiafava from MinnMax, and so if you snuck into my house, it's probably because you're looking for a bunch of board game recommendations, right? Lucky for you, I'm surrounded by board games. I'm gonna overlook the invasion of privacy because I want to talk to you about all these games. So let's go on to the studio and we'll talk about them. Come on.
All right, so we're just going to jump right in here with a couple. We're going to start with a couple tile laying games. And the first one is called Factory Funner, as you can see there. This is from All Play, which is kind of an interesting company because All Play started as, I think they were called board game tables, and they basically made really high-end board game tables and shelves and stuff, and they still do. But they have since started publishing their own board games as well, and you might question whether a board game table company has the chops when it comes to publishing board games, but they really do. They have picked some really smart and good games to kind of republish and rework a little bit. Factory Funner is one of those, and they have their own line of smaller games as well now that they're coming out with. All Play to me is kind of characterized by the fact that they pack a ton of game into a small box, and as you could see when I leafed through the instructions, like the instructions are always very short, a couple pages, but then the games themselves offer a lot more kind of interest and decisions to make. And so this one is, as it says, a 20 to 40 minute tile laying game where essentially what you're trying to do is you have these tiles that you will draft. You'll draft one of those every round, and you're basically just trying to build a factory out of it. And so each tile has an input of a couple different, maybe a couple different colors that has to go into it, and then it has an output that you have to pipe into either a kind of a blank receptacle there or into your other machines. And so basically you do that with all the other tubing that you can see over to the side there. And it's really basically just you play over like 8 rounds, and each round you're going to be adding one of those machines, and then you can reconfigure it however you need to in order to satisfy what the tile needs from it. And so it seems simple, but it actually becomes really thinky really quickly because you can redo all the pipes and everything basically, but once you put down one of those machines, it's there for the rest of the game. And so it really, really quickly, like obviously the first couple rounds are totally simple because you're just, you only have a couple things that you have to connect to it, and that's fine. But once you get into the later rounds, like things start to jam up really quickly, and you really have to think. Ideally, you will be thinking ahead of how you're going to add new machines into it to make them all work out. But if you don't, it really becomes this puzzle of like, well, okay, if I put that one there and then I reconfigure these pipes, like maybe I can squeak out another connection here and get it to work. And so I like Factory Funner because a lot of tile laying games end up being pretty simple. It's there are a ton that's like, okay, basically put these Tetris shapes into this little square, and it's usually pretty straightforward. And this one, while the rules are still really simple and straightforward, it gives you this really crunchy spatial puzzle to have to try and figure out each one. Each one of those machines, you can see the number on it. That's how many points you'll get, but you will subtract basically every piece that you use costs you a currency dollar, whatever factory fun buck, which will kind of take away from the points. And so it has an interesting cadence to it because, like I said, it gets really tricky as you continue building out, and you can totally work yourself into a corner with it, and it kind of takes a couple plays to figure out how conservative you should be in the early rounds. So if you're looking for kind of a thinkier tile laying game, I would totally recommend Factory Funner. The second tile laying game that I wanted to talk about, though, is also from All Play, and this one's called Habitats. This is another reprint of a Habitats. I think has gone through a couple reprints at this point, but this one is super interesting. This one, you're basically building out a zoo of some sort, and you are doing it through kind of tile drafting again, but then each tile that you draft has its own requirements for how it will score, essentially. Each one will give you a certain number of points, but in order to score them, you will first have to put other tiles around it that kind of fulfill the habitat requirements that it has. And so you'll be able to see that here, where the tile drafting is also interesting, because I haven't really seen a draft like this before, but basically you have one of those big chunky Jeep meeples, or Jeeples, as you could call them if you wanted to, but you'll move it one space, either front, forward, or to the left or to the right each turn, and then you will take that tile. And so turns can actually go really quick between players, because once you have picked your tile, the other people can start going while you kind of figure out how you want it to go into your little zoo there. But so like with that tile, you can see that basically it's worth 2 points, but it has to be next to at least one blue tile. And the more points that a tile is worth, the way more, requirements that they have. And so like that one there requires several blue tiles, a green tile, and a yellow tile, which are all different biomes or whatnot. But so they have to be touching those tiles, but if it requires multiple tiles of one type, it has to just be touching one of those groups. And so it becomes this really interesting spatial puzzle as you are filling out all the different tiles, trying to fulfill as many of them as you can, with, from round to round. And so basically once the round track there runs out, that qualifies as a year, and then you will score there's like 2 bonus ways that you score points. And so you'll go through 3 years doing those. And so those kind of just give you extra ways to score points. Some of the other tiles aren't animals; they're, lookout towers or other gates or things like that will score points in different ways. So it actually gives you a bunch of different ways to score tiles or to score points. And as well, the year objectives there change from game to game. So they have really packed in a lot of variety into this design, which I also really appreciate. And there's just something fun about, creating your own little zoo, and each tile is like a different animal. And so it's like, well, okay, I'm going to take that one. Maybe not, it's whatever points it scores, I don't care, because it's a fox, and I want foxes in my zoo. And there's just something satisfying about that. And then the other great thing about this one is that you may have seen the scoreboard up there. I think you may see it here again in a second, but they included a dry erase scoreboard, which is just so nice. It's very big. It shows it breaks down every single way that you can score points on it, and you can just write right on there and then erase it after you're done with the game. Great art on all of the tiles, all of the different animal tiles. I think pretty much every single tile is completely unique, and has its own unique scoring. And so this is just another really great one. I have been really impressed by All Play's games, and they just, like I said, they pack a lot into pretty small boxes, to the point where like it's like they're almost too packed. They could stand to be a little bit bigger when it comes to getting everything shoved back in there. But just Habitats is another great tile laying game. I think I like this one a little more than Factory Funner. I think it's a little easier to get to the table with people who don't want their brain to explode when they're playing a tile laying game. But that one is Habitats is definitely worth checking out as well. From there, let's see. We've got a kind of set collection game. This one is called Vivarium. It's from Studio H, which is one of the multiple companies that Hachette is the publisher, and they're kind of publishing a bunch of different games. They are another one of these really interesting up and coming publishers. At least in North America, they're up and coming. And they made Acropolis, which is one that I talked about in the last video I think that I did, and they're just really exploding at this point with a lot of really interesting games that kind of fall into that light medium weight that are really easy to get to the table and play with a wide range of people. And so Vivarium here is kind of like a collecting, you're collecting monsters kind of like Pokemon, but it's ultimately a drafting game. I like card drafting games in general, but I like them when they come up with an interesting way to do the draft. And so this one, there have been a couple different games that kind of have a tableau like this that you're drafting cards from. But this one adds these little dominoes where basically you have 2 dominoes each turn. Each domino has 2 numbers, and so you have to use some combination of those numbers which correspond to the rows and the columns. And whichever ones you use, you'll take that card. And then you're just basically collecting a bunch of cards, and after, however many rounds, that's it. You're going to score them, and that's basically the entire game. You have gems there as well, which are one of the things that you can collect. That card, for instance, gives you a gem. You can use those gems to basically add or subtract a number from one of the dominoes if you don't have the correct, like if you really want to get a card that, before someone else drafts it off of the table, you can use your gems. Otherwise, they're worth points at the end. But basically, the top 2 rows are the monsters, and each monster kind of belongs to a type of monster and also a, background or biome, essentially, again. And so they'll score points on their own, but then the bottom row there, basically, you're drafting cards that will give you different ways to score points. And I love when drafting games and just games in general do that, where it's like they're essentially point salad games where you can score in a lot of different ways, but you are choosing the ways that you score based on which ones you draft. So you might draft, a couple of those. It will give you points for the different types of monsters, so you want to go with those. You also start with 2 cards that basically give you a biome type and a monster type that you will score points. So that kind of gives you a focus when you start. But then you'll draft different ones that you want to focus on yourself. You get to choose that as the game goes on. And then the second to bottom row there also gives you different abilities that you can kind of use as you're playing. So just really, there are a lot of drafting games, but this one kind of has carved out its own interesting niche. It's light enough that pretty much anyone can play, but it still gives you like the replayability is just kind of built into the having the different ways that you can score and being able to choose those different ways. And so depending on which ones are coming out, that's going to affect which of the actual monster cards that you're collecting that game, and that's going to change from game to game. And it's half an hour, as it says there. That's like it's a quick snappy game, and I am always happy to get one of those to the table. Not a lot of setup or tear down as well to that one. So that is Vivarium, definitely one to check out. And speaking of smaller games, I guess I wasn't really speaking of that, but I will speak to that now. Basically, I always appreciate games that come, like, there is a trend now in board games of just bigger and bigger and bigger boxes that will take up, an entire shelf by themselves. But I appreciate when you can pack a lot of game into a small package, and you don't get more of a game in a smaller box than Village Rails. This one is from Osprey Games. As it says, 2 to 4 players, 45 minutes. This is another one where you are drafting cards. You're drafting train cards, basically. But there's a spatial element to this one as well, where you're basically building out little train routes within your little framework there. And this one is another really thinky game. Not a lot of rules, very basic drafting here. You basically have these lines of cards, and you can take the bottom one for free, or if you want to go higher up in the ones that you're drafting, you have to leave a coin on each one that you're skipping over. And then if someone drafts that one in the future, they get the card and the money that was on it. So very, very straightforward. There are a number of games that do that. But what's interesting about this one is you are drafting those tracks, and then you're building out this grid of railroad tracks. And so you'll have, like, I think, what is that? 7 tracks by the time that you're done with it. But so you're building out the tracks, and then you can also draft on the right-hand side there. And this is another very clever way that they designed this game, where the front of the cards are basically train tracks. The back of the cards are different ways to score those tracks as well, again. And so once again, this is another game where you are drafting the ways that you are scoring points, which, as I said, I really enjoy. And so you can basically, you buy the scoring objectives with your coins, and then you will lay them out on the tracks that you want to score that specific criteria on. And then when you finish one of those tracks, that's when you score it. And so that creates this really interesting kind of cadence to the game, where you have to figure out when you want to draft the actual scorecards. You want to figure out which of the tracks you want to draft, but you don't want to complete tracks until you have the scoring objectives associated with them. And you can have 2 scoring objectives for each one. And then you'll see that card there. You have a handful of these ticket cards, which basically each time you complete a track, you will turn one of those in, and those will always score you. Those will give you not more points, but it will give you more money, which you then use in order to buy the objectives and also skip the cards that you don't want. And so it's a really interesting economy to it. It's a really interesting kind of spatial puzzle with the tracks. There are a ton of ways that you can score, which you can see there. And you just you end up building these ways to combo together a ton of points in this very small, compact, train-themed drafting game. And so, again, if you kind of prize shelf space for your games, like, you get a ton of really interesting decisions in this tiny little train box. So that is Village Rails, definitely worth checking out. The next one is a card game that I've kind of been dreading trying to explain. This, out of all the games, this is probably the one that will make your brain explode, especially if you're not super familiar with trick-taking games. But so Cat in the Box, it's based on Schrodinger's cat, because why wouldn't you make a board game about that? But essentially, it's a trick-taking game. And in trick-taking games, everybody has a hand of cards with a couple different suits. Here, they're just They're just the colors, red, yellow, blue, and green. And in a normal trick-taking game, someone will play a card, and that will determine the color for that round. And so then everyone, if they can, they have to play that color. And the person who plays the highest card in that color will win that round. The wrinkle to it, which makes trick-taking games interesting, is that there's usually a trump suit as well. And so if you don't have the color that someone else played, and you play the trump suit, all of a sudden that number counts as the highest number, and you will win that hand of cards, okay? And so I appreciate that that's a little confusing, but there are a ton of trick-taking games based on that kind of formula. And so nowadays we're kind of going through this renaissance of trick-taking games where a bunch of people are coming out with designs that build off that and add interesting twists to it. The twist on this one, which you may have been able to tell from the hand of cards, is that none of the cards actually have colors on them. You choose which color the card is when you play it, which is kind of insane and sounds like it shouldn't work. But basically, when you put a card out, you just say what color it is. Basically, at the beginning of the round, everyone will choose how many of the hands they think they will win, or tricks that you'll win. And then when you play the cards, you just say, okay, you put down a 6 and you say, okay, this is a blue 6. Great. Now everyone else has to play a blue card. But at any point, someone can say, you know what, actually, I'm out of blue cards. So now I'm going to play a red card, which is the trump color in Cat in the Box. And so they'll say, okay, I'm out of blue cards. This is a red card. My red 1 now beats your blue 6. Yay for me. But for the rest of that round, that person can't play any more blue cards because they've already said that they're out of blue cards. And so that becomes like this really crazy, mind-blowing like twist to it, where because you can back yourself into a corner essentially, where you have said that you don't have any more of these colors, but maybe those are the only colors that are left for the numbers that you have in your hand. And if that happens, it's basically called a paradox. That's the Schrodinger's paradox. And the round immediately ends, and you're not going to score any points, basically, with whatever you did during that round. And so there's a bit of push your luck to like deciding when you're going to say, okay, I'm out of this suit, and I'm just not going to play that suit anymore, but I'm going to do that now because it's to my advantage and I can start winning tricks. Like I said, you kind of bid at the beginning of the round of how many of the tricks you're going to win, and so you really have to hit that number. And you're just going to you kind of have to figure out how you're going to actually make that happen. And then the other interesting thing about this one is that once everybody's done, you can see everybody has tokens of their color that they will put out on the colors that they're playing. So that's how you track, like, okay, blue 6 has already been played, red 6 has already been played, that kind of thing. But at the end, if you actually collected the number of tricks that you said you were going to, you'll also score bonus points based on the biggest group of tokens that you have next to each other orthogonally, which is just another like mind-blowing layer on top of, choosing what color your cards are as you're playing. And so if you like trick-taking games, which I really do, this is kind of like the top tier of really thinky, different trick-taking games without it being. Sometimes trick-taking games can become like super convoluted, and I wouldn't call this one super convoluted. You can kind of, it will take you a couple hands to absorb the rules and how kind of naming your colors works. But once you get that, it's really interesting and it's really thinky, and it plays like no other trick-taking game in a really good way. So that is Cat in the Box. Definitely worth checking out. Maybe it wouldn't be the first trick. I wouldn't make this your first trick-taking game. You can actually play Hearts with just a normal deck of cards. That's where trick-taking games came from. So maybe check out some other trick-taking games first, but once you know, if you're a big fan of them and you've kind of become a pro, you know, and you have a group that likes to play trick-taking games, really check this one out. It's definitely worth it. Okay, from there, let's go with something super simple, a nice simple party game, and that is Ole Guacamole. This is from Scorpion Mask. This is another one of Hachette's kind of sub-publishers that they publish games for. This is a 2 to 8 player party word game. And basically, as you'll be able to see here, this will make sense in a second, I promise. But basically, each turn, you're going to flip over a letter when it's your turn, and then you have to say a word that doesn't contain any of those letters. And so you say dog or whatever, and then the next person adds a letter to the pile, and they have to say another word that doesn't contain any of those letters, but also relates back to the word that the person before them said. And so you get this big string. You know, the letters keep piling up, but basically, as you can see from like the fake pantomime video that I put together there, like once you start getting letters up there, your brain immediately tries to make words with those letters, and that's what makes it a really funny and fun party game. Because a lot of word games, like I'm an editor by trade, and so I'm pretty good at word games, and not a lot of people like playing word games with me because of that. But this is this is a word game that doesn't rely on having a big vocabulary. It's not even like liking and enjoying word games doesn't really help you here anyway, because you have like this funny puzzle that breaks your brain where you get a couple words out there and it's like, and you know, it's timed. Like you have to say a word within, you know, 5 or 10 seconds or whatever. So as soon as you get those words out there, you look at them, your brain starts making words with those letters in there, and you have to kind of remove that and think, okay, this person said dog. I need a word that's related to dog that doesn't have F-U or R in it. I can only think of fur, and time's up, and then you have to take those cards. And basically, the way you score it at the end is whoever has the fewest cards, or, you know, like the scoring is very simple. Very quick, very fun, and very funny party game. That's Ole Guacamole. Definitely worth checking out. Another light game. This is a roll and write game. We're back to all play here. And this is another one of these lines where they have a smallish box that gives you a lot of content. This is a very simple roll and write game, where basically everyone is going to get a location, and it comes with basically a bunch. Because it plays up to 6 players, each of those envelopes has 6 dry erase sheets that are both double-sided. So you have these 6 different locations, but basically everyone will get one of these location cards, and then you will roll a big handful of these dice. And the dice, you know, they're just numbered dice, but they're all, as you can see, they're all different sized dice. So the spread of numbers is different for each die. But basically, you'll roll all the dice out, and then you will use those. You'll basically be writing those numbers into your little picture here of whatever the location is. But you have to write them from low number to high number. And basically, anytime you put a number on top of other boxes, that number has to be either equal to the numbers below it or higher. So, you can see I have a couple of threes there. On top of those threes, you can go 4, 5, or whatever. But you have to balance, how quickly you're filling in all the boxes. The winning condition here is just you fill in all the boxes. So it's a race to fill in all the boxes, but you have to pay it. You're kind of balancing how quickly you fill in all the boxes with how high you want the numbers to go. The other thing is you can add up the numbers on the dice. So you can get the highest die is a D20, so it goes up to 20, but you can add even more numbers on top of that. But you're trying to fill them in as fast as you can. You want to be careful that you're not jumping up, higher numbers too high from round to round, because also every round before you roll the dice, you will roll that weird looking die, which will basically subtract or add dice back to the die pool. And so you can use that to your advantage. If someone else has already filled in numbers and they need higher numbers, you can kind of weed out the higher dice, so that you're rolling lower numbers and you can kind of control it that way. But basically, very simple rolling, right? Very simple idea there. But once again, like all play, they give you enough, dry erase sheets to play 6 players on each of the different, locations. And each of the locations, because of the way that all the little boxes are kind of laid out, like they play differently, and it's really kind of it's interesting to see how differently each sheet plays from one another. The dice are really nice. It's nice that it's all dry erase, like just very high production values, like all of other all play games, like all of their other games. So really nice rolling, right? Very family friendly. Anyone can play it. Kids can play it, and you may not beat the kids when you play against them, because it really just kind of, there's certainly luck to it, but it's a satisfying little, very lighthearted, roll and write type of game. So that's Roll to the Top Journeys. Definitely worth checking that one out. Okay, we got a bunch of 2-player games here. I play a lot of 2-player games. The first one here is called Rift Force. This is from Capstone Games. Capstone Games makes a lot of interesting games. I talked about New York Zoo in the last video that I did, which is another tile laying game. This one is a head-to-head card game. It's a little bit like Battle Line or Shot and Totten. There's kind of a series of games where you have these essentially these lanes. You can see them there. There's like 5 or 6 lanes, and you will be playing cards to your side of those areas with different numbers on them, and you're basically you're going to be scoring points through that. But basically, what makes this game interesting and what makes it unique is you have these 8 different decks of cards, and each of those decks has basically a special ability associated with it, and so you will draft 3 of those or 4 of those. So I guess it's actually 10 different decks. But each of you will draft 4 of those, and then you will make one big deck out of all those 4, and doing so will give you 4 different special abilities, basically. And so when you play out your cards, you will play them up to 3 cards, basically, that all have the same number or different numbers, but they're all in the same suit. Like different monster types, basically. And so you will be playing those out to the different areas there, and then you'll score points basically when you refill your hand. You will score points if you have any cards in those different locations that your enemy doesn't have. Your opponent doesn't have areas. So if it's uncontested, you'll score points. But otherwise, the more common way that you'll score points is if you defeat, whenever you defeat an enemy card, basically, you'll score points. And each of those cards, each of the different deck types, basically gives you a different way that you will do damage to your opponent, or that you will score points. And so it's a really interesting, because you're mixing up that deck with, 4 of the 10 different factions, you're going to have a different collection of special abilities each turn or each time you play. And then you're basically just trying to figure out how to use those, which cards from your hand, how you're going to play them out, and how you're going to use those abilities to score points against your opponent. Very, it's only a 2-player game. It's very head-to-head, back and forth. It's, I guess, a little mean, but it's kind of the nature of the game. I don't think you're not going to like hurt anyone's feelings too much if that's a concern. With the people, people that you're playing with. But just really interesting, really smart kind of variation on that head-to-head, back to forth card game. And so that is Rift Force. But I have another head-to-head card game here is Summoner Wars. This is from Plaid Hat Games. Again, it's just a 2-player game, a little longer with this one, but this is another game with a bunch of different decks of cards that you're going to be kind of mixing together to make your own faction. And so in this one, you have this big board, and this is another thing that makes this game interesting, is that there are a lot of tactical games where you have, a bunch of minis that you're moving around. But in this one, all of your cards and all of your characters are these cards, basically. And so each card tells you that character's, health. It tells you how much attack power they have, and it tells you whatever special abilities that you have. And so basically, you'll pick a deck, your opponent will pick a deck, and then you will kind of set it up, and you will fight back and forth. And so each of you has a summoner, which is the card that I just put down there. You'll be able to see them later. But you're basically trying to defeat your opponent's summoner over the course of the game here. And you have a currency, basically a magic currency, which will affect, each card has a certain amount of the currency that it takes to set them out there. And so you're drawing a hand of cards from your deck, but you're choosing between which ones you want to play out there and which ones you want to discard, because every card that you discard gives you that currency that you need in order to play out future cards. And so it's a very thinky game. It's hard to kind of get an idea from this very simple description, essentially, of what's going on. But it's a really interesting, really well-made and well-balanced tactical game where, like, all these cards are different characters. You're moving them around. You're attacking. You have a big, handful of dice there that you will either be ranged attacks or melee attacks. But then a lot of the cards, they all basically have another special ability or another wrinkle that kind of overwrites the basic rules of the game. And in a larger scope, all of the different decks, which it comes with like 6 decks or whatever, all of those are different factions, and they all have their own really interesting way that they play. Some might be focused more on healing. Some will bring back characters from the dead. Like they all have a very different play style to them. And so this is considered, this core box is like the master set 2nd edition, because there was a whole 1st edition that they're kind of reworking now and re-releasing. And so there's a ton of replayability in just this core box with the different factions that they come. You can also actually like draft and create your own deck from all these different cards. There are different symbols that you can kind of match up and make your own custom decks out of it as well. But like just the base game gives you a ton of replayability, and it, the different, each matchup is going to feel different based on the different factions that you're putting in, that you're going head to head against. But then they also, Plaid Hat Games is releasing a bunch of standalone little decks that you can add, basically different faction decks that are much cheaper, that you can basically buy and throw into your big selection here, and so that just gives you more decks to pull from and mix and match with your opponent. The other thing that's really interesting about it, and that really helps, because it is a bit of a more complicated game, but the nice thing is that you can kind of see at the bottom of the board there on both sides, it runs down what, step by step, what you do on your turn, which is just so nice, and makes it so much easier to follow along, where it's like, okay, first, you play whichever characters you want, and then you move them, and then you do the attack, and then you build structures, and like, it makes it so much easier to kind of follow along and get through a match. Just having all that information right there at the bottom. You also have the track for tracking how much magic you have and how much you're spending on that from round to round. So just a very, I guess, like, I shouldn't be surprised, because this is a second edition of a very popular game. So they're taking, what was a tried and true game, they're kind of refreshing it, and coming up with more factions and kind of rebalancing everything. So just a ton of game in this box, that has been really well balanced and really well thought out. And so if you like 2-player games, and again, it's nice having this tactical, head-to-head game where everything is just cards. Like, everything that you need to know about that character is just right there. You can look at the card at any point. And so that's really cool as well. Another head-to-head 2-player game. This one I am just totally in love with. This is called Mind Bug. It's by Richard Garfield, who is the creator of Magic, which kind of makes him a legend in his own right, but he has made a ton of other, both card games, head-to-head card games, and other board games. This one is published by Nerd Lab Games, and I want to say it's a little hard to get now. You have to go basically to the website of if you just Google Mind Bug, you'll be able to find it. But I think it is getting a larger release. They just announced, so it'll hopefully be easier to get. But basically, so the creator of Magic made this new head-to-head 2-player card game that is basically like if you shrunk down Magic into this set thing. So you don't have to collect a bunch of cards or have random booster packs or anything like that. You just have this deck of cards that comes with a ton of these unique monsters. And so you'll have your own very small deck of cards that are drawn from that larger deck. Your opponent will have them. You'll start with a hand of those cards, and you will, on your turn, you're either going to play one of your monster cards down in front of you, or you will attack with one of your monster cards. And you're basically just trying to hit your opponent, 3 times, or although that can vary based on the abilities. But basically, each card has a power to it, and then it has some kind of crazy game-breaking ability. Like Turbo Bug right there, you can see when you attack with it, your opponent loses all of their life points except for 1, which is just insane. And so all of these different cards, all of these different unique monsters, they all have these crazy abilities, which begs the question of like, how do you possibly balance it? And this is what makes Mind Bug so crazy and so interesting, because the way that they've essentially balanced it is you have 2 Mind Bug cards that you start the game with, and you can see them there. But basically, whenever you play a card on your turn, Once you put out that card, your opponent can decide whether they want to use one of their 2 mind bugs, and if they use it, they essentially steal it, and it becomes their card for the rest of the game. And that little, quote unquote, simple trick, right? This one crazy trick essentially self-balances the game, because you may have a super OP card like Turbo Bug there, but you don't want to play it until you have essentially baited your opponent into using their mind bugs by stealing your other cards, and then you can play it. And so that it makes you hold on to your most powerful cards until later in the game in order to use them, at which point your opponent probably has some, their own monster cards out there, because you can use those to block incoming attacks. And so it really kind of just takes the best and most interesting aspects of Magic, but shrinks it down into a much more digestible game. If you're not like, Magic is a bit overwhelming for me. I play a lot of games, but it's still overwhelming because there are so many keywords and there's so much strategy, and people who play Magic are really good at it. This basically gives you a similar feeling with only a handful of keywords that you have to figure out. They're very straightforward, but then it's a really condensed, it says 15 to 25 minutes. That's totally like it really does play that short. And it's just this really interesting mind game where it's like you're trying to figure out when to use your mind bugs to steal the opponent's cards that they're playing on you, when you want to play out your best cards, or when you want to hold them back in order to try and trick them into using theirs. And it's just a crazy mix of super powerful cards. Even like when I was flipping through the cards when I was recording this, it's like you stop and you look at these cards and it's like, oh my God, like that's a really interesting power that card has. And so really interesting design. And then what's really great about this design is that, you buy the initial deck, which is, like 50 cards or whatever, and it has, 25 to however many unique cards. But then they are creating and selling other. It's basically like a living card game, which is different from a trading card game, like Magic or Pokemon, where you just buy another deck. There in this version of the game, there's 2 decks. That's the second deck, which is also standalone by itself. You can just play with that deck. But basically, that just gives you a ton of. You can buy another one of these follow-up decks and mix it in, and all of a sudden you have twice the number of crazy, creatures that you can play with. And as long as they keep coming out with those, like, I will happily add them to the mix and keep playing with those, because it's just a really interesting, in terms of all the kind of head-to-head card games that are out there, this one instantly became my favorite because it's very simple, but it's also very, like, rules-wise, it's very simple, but then and very quick to play, but also very thinky. So that is Mind Bug. Okay, just 2 more today, and then we'll be done. The first one, boy, this one, I love this one as well. This is Watergate. Completely opposite end of the spectrum from pretty much everything else we've talked about. This is another one from Capstone Games, another 2-player specific game. 30 to 60 minutes. Not too long, doesn't take too long. Really interesting. So this is obviously based on Watergate, which I love. One person is playing as Nixon. The other person is playing as essentially the media investigating Nixon. And it's a really interesting head-to-head tug-of-war game. One of the things I love about it right off the bat here is that, like, the rule book looks really, really thick. Like it's going to be a ton of rules, but it turns out like the back half of the rule book is just an explanation of all the characters, like all the real life people who were involved in Watergate, and basically gives you like a breakdown, an entire history lesson. You could take the rule book into a class and basically teach Watergate out of the back of this book. But so basically, at its core, It's a very thematic game, but it is a head-to-head kind of tug of war game. You can see there's a track there on the right hand of the board, which is just a bunch of numbers that go back and forth. There's a neutral spot in the middle, and each round you're going to have a hand of cards that are going to let you move those pieces back and forth. And so the white token there is important because that will give you an initiative on future rounds, which basically determines who goes first and who gets more cards than the other one. So you want to get that on your side. The red tokens are basically how Nixon wins. He has to collect 5 of those in order to win. So you don't want to let him get too many. The political reporters, as they collect them, that will give you like different super powerful bonuses as you're going. But then those black tokens are kind of the heart of the game, where they are evidence, and they're basically different colors. And you want to get them to your side of the board. If the reporter gets them on their side at the end of the round, you will put them out on the board, and you're basically trying to connect witnesses to the center of the board. You have to connect 2 witnesses to the center. If you do that, you win. If Nixon gets those evidence pieces on his side, he puts them out, but he puts them out with the black side up, which is basically like redacted. And that will block those connections that you're trying to make. So there's a connection puzzle to it, but everything is head-to-head, and it's all this battle over trying to get what stuff are you going to get on your side, which ones are you going to fight over, and which ones are you going to kind of cede to your opponent. But you do all that with these cards. So the cards, you can see they have a different color piece of evidence on them, so you can move that number of spaces. You can always use them to move a token. But what makes the cards really interesting is they all have these special powers on them as well. And those special powers, again, this is another one of those games where it's like every power seems totally OP, like it's going to break the game, like you're going to win because you have it on your side. But they end up being strangely balanced. And so, like, you may have one that will move everything your way, and it's like, that's awesome. You know, Nixon has one card where he puts it out, and basically the round ends just right there. It's like his presidential power, and it's like, that's it. This round is over. And so it just like nukes that round with everything set where it is. So you hopefully, you'll ideally pull some stuff towards you, then you slap that card down, and then it's over. But a lot of those cards, like the overpowered ones, they're one-time use, and then they're out of the game. And so there's a really interesting pacing to this game as well, where it's like as if you're playing as Nixon, which I did in my first game, like, you really want to get that game, you want to get it done as fast as you can, and you really have to collect those red tokens to get to the end of the game, because the longer it goes, the more it drags out. Like the press player, they have more abilities that are going to help them kind of fill in those connections. They have cards that can like flip over some of the ones that you use to block. And so it ends up being this really interesting and really thematically well done thematic game, because like, I'll tell you, playing as Nixon, I was sitting there and I could, in the like an insane board game type of a way, I could tell what he was feeling, because you're just sitting there thinking like, that Bernstein's there, like they're gonna get this evidence, like, and another interesting like thematic touch is that when the evidence goes out, like, Nixon looks at it, he knows what the different colors are, but the press player doesn't. And so like, just a ton of really interesting thematic touches. You can tell they researched the heck out of it when they were making it, and it's a super interesting, super fun head-to-head game that is very, very thematic. Like, if you are interested in history at all, if you have a friend that's interested in history, like, this is a really fun, interesting one to play. Even if you don't give a crap about history or you don't care about Watergate, it's a really fun tug-of-war game. So that's Watergate. Okay, last game for today. Might be my favorite from the bunch. This is Oracalcum from Pandasaurus Games. This is, as you can tell from this, there's a ton in this box, but what makes it really interesting, what makes it really fun is it's actually pretty simple. This is essentially kind of a 4X game. That term gets thrown around a lot in the video game space and in the board game space. But basically, you are filling out this map with tiles. You're fighting these, Greek enemies. But the whole thing is a race to 5 points, essentially. You have a couple different ways that you can get points. And more than any other game, like, this one has so many interesting, just nice little touches that create a positive experience for the player. They're like player positive game design here, just in a nutshell. And so essentially, you're drafting those cards out there. Each card that you draft, it will give you a tile that you will build out on your board to fill in your map there. But then it will also give you an ability that you do. And the abilities are pretty basic. Like you'll collect gold, which you spend on stuff. You'll collect those little hoplite characters, which are basically little soldiers. You'll fight the enemies that come out, or you will build like these other special tokens that give you special abilities. But so it's a race to 5 points. And so you're getting those points from basically building out little collections on the board. And this is, again, like I could probably double the length of this video, which I won't do, but I could double it just talking about all the interesting little things in this game. But basically, if you get a collection of the same type of terrain out there, you'll get those god cards to the side of the board, and a god card will count as a point. But if any of your opponents, make a larger group than that, then they'll take that card from you. So it's kind of a transitive point. You have it temporarily. It also gives you an ability, which is really satisfying to use. But then basically, you'll do one action each turn. But the other thing that's really great about the game is that you can use all of these other resources, the gold or the hoplites. You can basically turn those in to do an additional action each turn. And so that's really great too. You're fighting monsters, like I said, and it's like you're rolling dice to defeat those monsters. But each monster basically has a number on it, and you have to roll higher than that number. Each of the little blue warriors that you send to that spot will let you roll another die. But another one of those really nice touches is that each die also has a skull on it, and if you roll any skulls at all, you instantly defeat that opponent. And so that adds this really nice push your luck element to it as well. The soldiers that you put out there, another really nice touch. When you put the soldiers out, if you don't defeat the enemy, the soldiers just stay there so that you can use them the next time you do fights. And so that adds that feels good. It doesn't feel like you're losing. You're losing those soldiers. If you defeat the enemy, then they retire, quote unquote retire. They go off. Okay, so you've spent them or whatever. But if you don't, they stick around, and that also adds to like the push your luck element, because it's like, okay, well, that's a 12. He's going to be hard to defeat, but maybe I'll send two guys there so I can roll 3 dice. I might not get it, but if I don't, I can always just, roll again. Next turn, I can fight again and try and defeat him. And if I roll a skull, then I beat him, and, everything's good. And so just a lot of really smart, interesting things like that. You can also build temples, which will give you the victory points. And you can also just buy the victory points if you have 5 gold. So like the economy is all this really interesting, satisfying, interconnected web as well. Like every resource basically has multiple uses. They all feel good when you use them that way. You have a bunch of different little buildings that you can build that will give you unique powers, which always feels really good. And you're just kind of filling out the board and racing to be the person, you know, who gets to 5 points before your opponent. Just a really smart design. Doesn't take a long time to play. Like, really solid stuff. Pandasaurus is another one of those companies. They've been around for a long time. They really seem to be ramping up the number of releases that they're putting out, though, and they've just really hit a sweet spot of great production quality, you know, great designs that they are choosing to bring out, great artwork. Their games are always beautiful looking. This one is no exception. Just a really, really great, fun game. All right, folks, that was 12 more recommendations. They're all great games. Hopefully you'll find something there that will work with your interests and your gaming groups. If you got any value out of this whatsoever, if you found it informative or entertaining, or you just like to laugh at me, hey, I'll take it. Please consider going to patreon.com/MinnMax, 2 N's. Check out our support tiers there. We got a ton of great content going up all the time. We have an excellent community that we would like you to be a part of. So please check that out. Until next time, thank you for watching.
You've seen the headlines. You know that the media landscape is consolidating. Having truly independent games media is more important than ever. MinnMax can exist independently as a place about games, friends, and getting better, but we need your help. The good news is that it's easy. Just click on that subscribe button or unlock a mountain of benefits by going to patreon.com/MinnMax with 2 N's. Thanks so much, everybody.